All right, why don't we go ahead and get started? Thanks again, everybody, for joining us today for our next installment of our CECL Coffee Talk for community banks. We've got a nice large crowd here today, so we appreciate you all joining us. And we're going to go ahead and start with the presentation. A couple of things to point out first. I'd like to introduce ourselves. With me today, Sean O'Brien is not here with us today, but instead we have Greg Dingens. Greg?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I have a background in investment banking and investing, but I'm also, most importantly, one of the co-founders of Quick Analytics here with Sean O'Brien, and have been involved in developing a lot of the tools that you see and hopefully use and find helpful on Quick Analytics.
Thank you, Greg. Again, my name is Steve Huntington. You may be familiar with me from walkthroughs that you've had on the tool or through these webinars that we've been giving on a regular basis. I've spent my entire career working with community banks in doing valuation, M&A advisory, strategic planning, capital planning, and more recently, over the last decade or so, building these sorts of more interactive analytical tools for community banks. So just for a couple of minutes here about the agenda for today, we're going to give a brief introduction of the CECL Solver tool. I know a lot of you on the call are current users, which is great, so we won't spend too much time, but we do have a lot of interested parties here as well who are less familiar with how the tool works. So we'll do a very brief introduction for how the CECL tool works. And then we're going to address a couple new questions that we tend to get a lot in talking with users and regulators and examiners and auditors. And then we'll open it up to a more free-flowing audience Q&A. This is a little bit more of an informal format than we've done with other webinars in the past. So feel free at any point to go ahead and ask some questions. We were planning, I know we mentioned last month, we were planning on having an auditor on as a guest on the call this month. Unfortunately, we couldn't get the stars aligned from a scheduling standpoint. So we anticipate doing that next month. So check your email invitation for next month's coffee talk, and we'll confirm that we're going to have some outside parties on that call. First, just quickly, how to ask those questions. You guys are all muted, so you can hear us, but we can't hear you. If you have a question, there's a little Q&A box down there, and you can click on that and ask your questions. They'll pop up on the screen for us. And if they're topical to what we're discussing, we'll kind of pause and maybe address them immediately, or wait to the Q&A section, the open Q&A section afterwards. You can also use the chat if you'd like. If you're having any technical issues as far as audio or video, or any back and forth conversations that you'd like to have, you can also use the chat feature as well. So again, why we're here today, sort of already covered this. We hear a lot of questions. We have a lot of users on the platform, and we think that this is a good forum to kind of try to reach everybody all at once, so you can get sort of the most recent events. We're certainly discussing things with regulators and auditors on a daily basis. And as we have enhancements to the tool, this is also a great forum for us to introduce those to our current users and to potential new users as well. So again, just a quick brief overview of how the CECL tool works. We heavily utilize the weighted average remaining maturity methodology, or the WARM method, for applying to for complying with CECL. One of the biggest benefits of using our tool is that when you first log in, we're taking advantage of the data that we can get from the call reports that we've been filing with consistent loan segmentation for both your bank as well as your competitors, going back in time pretty much forever. So when you first log in, all of your historical loss data and balance data and past due data by loan segment is already preloaded into the system from day one. So you can really get started on messing around with the assumptions, playing with the assumptions that you want to make, and seeing in real time exactly what effect or impact it's going to have on your reserve from a CECL standpoint. Because the entire tool is built in a very interactive environment, as soon as you change an input or an assumption, everything recalculates in real time. And so you get an immediate idea of whether the assumptions you're changing really, whether the output is sensitive to it, or if it's really kind of irrelevant from a CECL perspective, which can help you build scenarios and modify things in a lot more efficient manner. The first step that you would take in running the tool is doing some warm calculations. Warm, again, no matter what methodology you use for satisfying CECL or complying with CECL, you're going to have to get a feel for what the average remaining life of the loans you have on the books is, right? Since CECL is all about estimating losses over the remaining life of the assets, we have to get a feeling for what the remaining life is for the different pools or segments that we're using. And once we plug in a weighted average remaining maturity for the segmentation in the portfolio, the tool really goes to work and does the vast majority of the number crunching for us. We start by analyzing your historical experience over various look back periods. And then the second step, of course, is all the fudge factors, right? All those qualitative factor adjustments that cumulatively represent all the reasons we think current and future conditions might be a little bit different than the historical conditions, which we analyzed in the first part of using our tool. One of the big benefits of using our tool from a Q factor standpoint is that we give you really good external or environmental data that can help you in building your narrative and your justification for qualitative factor adjustments. A big challenge that we see a lot with our community banks using CECL is, for a lot of the segments of your portfolio, we've been living in a relatively benign asset quality environment for a relatively extended period now. So a lot of you on the call, I'm sure most of you probably have a segment of your portfolio, a good size segment, that has an almost negligible loss history over any reasonable historical time frame. No C&I losses over the last 5 years, right? Or net recoveries in your mortgage loans over the last 7 years total. How are we supposed to build and defend a CECL reserve for a segment where we have no real good recent historical loss experience? Because we know that the examiners certainly aren't going to accept the us reserving nothing for our mortgage portfolios just because we've had no losses over a reasonable period. That's where the ability to look outside of our four walls at the environment around us and analyze not just your experience, but your peers' experience. So if we look at all the other community banks in your neck of the woods and we just focus on multifamily residential loans or just focus on C&I, and we look at the loss patterns that all of your peers have had, and we can present them here, then even if you have no reasonable loss experience, you can look at the peer data at the segment level on an apples to apples way and really get some good guidance for what qualitative factor adjustments you might want to make. We allow you to build custom qualitative factor adjustments, not just the external ones that we provide data for. Certainly, and we also provide an area for you to manage unfunded commitments and individually assessed loans in the tool. Since it's all in an interactive environment, once you've built the scenario the way you want it, you can save scenarios right on the tool in the cloud. You can access them anytime you want to. You can save as many scenarios as you want to. In fact, that's a best practice. Every time you come in to update the tool, you should save a new scenario. And then really our tool becomes a repository of all of your saved CECL scenarios over time so that you can track not only, what the examiners are really looking for right now, which is, do you have a solution for CECL? Do you understand it conceptually, right? Do you understand what assumptions really move the needle and what's pretty irrelevant given your situation? 3, do you have an idea of what your surplus or shortfall might look like on day 1? And then 4, are you tracking it over time? Are you doing some parallel runs as we go through 2022? And so our tool is very purpose-built to help you demonstrate to examiners and auditors that you are prepared for CECL coming down the pike. Just one more kind of quick snapshot from the interactive tool. In addition to saving scenarios, of course, you'll want to be able to have a lot of flexibility around exporting it. When you're ready to share it with your board, you might want to export just a summary of it into an Excel or a PDF environment. Or if you're sharing with an auditor or an examiner, they might want a lot more detail. And so you have complete control over how and when, what kind of data that you export when you're ready to share the tool. So that's kind of just a brief overview of how the tool works. So first topic we wanted to talk about for a few minutes was on updating scenarios for the next quarter. We get questions a lot from people who are currently using the tool and might have done a run of it a couple months ago, and now they're ready to update it, whether you're updating it on a monthly basis or whether you're updating it on a quarterly basis, which right now is another, like many other things in CECL. I think we're going to use the word, Greg, we'll probably use the word subjective a lot today in our talk for sure. And but we find during 2022, running it or rerunning it on a quarterly basis when there's a lot of new data available is probably all that needs to be done. But certainly the tool can be updated on a monthly basis if it's something you want to start tracking in parallel on a monthly basis. But let me just walk through the steps of how you're going to update the tool. And then I'll share the interactive website, and we'll walk through actually taking an entire scenario that you ran a couple months ago, pushing all the data forward to this month, making the proper updates, and then resaving it as a new scenario. So again, you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you do a new parallel run. You certainly can create a new scenario completely from scratch if you so desire. However, you probably spent a good deal of time your first time around calculating your warms, intelligently going through your segment by segment and making qualitative factor adjustments, both internal and external, plugging in some information about individually assessed loans, and then managing some of the unfunded commitment section. So you don't have to redo that work each time. You can pull up an old scenario and then follow these steps. The first step is, do you need to update your warm calculations? Totally subjective at this point. It's a bit of a trial and error process. And what we tell people is, I would start by recalculating your warms on a quarterly basis. You certainly don't need to redo the entire warm calculations on a monthly basis, because there's just not going to be enough movement in your portfolio to have any real significant change in the warm calculations month to month. So I would start by doing it quarterly. And if you find after 2 or 3 quarters of recalculating your warms that they're changing by 1 basis point or 2 basis points, then you probably have enough information to say, hey, let's just go ahead and do this semi-annually so we don't waste any time. Certainly up to you, but I would start by doing it quarterly. Second step is rolling the historical data to the most recently available. If you have crossed that quarterly threshold, right, where we have an entire new data, quarter of historical loss data on the entire industry, not just your bank, but all your peers, you're going to want to make sure that we push that data from last quarter to this quarter, and I'll show you how to do that in just a moment. Third step is just revisiting qualitative factor adjustments, right? Since the last time you ran it, you're going to go through segment by segment. You're going to look at the narrative that you built around those qualitative factor adjustments and decide whether you think anything needs to be modified because of changes in the environment, the economy, or in your own credit picture. Step 4, enter current loan balances. So that's one of the most important steps that you make sure you cannot you take in updating a scenario, is you always want to plug in your current loan balances in the summary tab, because that defines the as of date, right? That defines the date that the CECL calculation is as of when your current balances are. And then finally, if any individual assessments need to be adjusted. So let me go ahead and share my other screen here so you can watch us kind of walk through that. Give me just a second. Okay. Greg, can you see my browser now? You're muted.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so I went ahead and kind of created a scenario. This is a sample bank we're using. It's a larger community bank based up in Maine. And this is a scenario that they might have created as of November 30th, right? They came in here 3 months ago, and they used September 30th industry loss data, and they had their balances plugged in as of November 30th. So here's all their data, their warms, their qualitative factor adjustments, their current balances as of November 30th, and the entire analysis is as of November 30th. Now, if I were to want to update this, again, first step, check those WARMs and decide whether you think they need to be modified or not. The second step, and this is one of the more critical ones, I go to the historical analysis and I'll see now that all the look back periods are as of September 30th. That's because when we ran this, that was the most recent data available. Now, let's say it's January 30th, right? You're running this now as of either January 30th. And we know the 12/31 data is available. So we come into the historical analysis and we want to push the whole data set into the next quarter. So I come right here to what's called set common date range, and I roll everything forward to 12/31 being the end of a look back period. Apply changes. It'll take just a couple seconds, and you'll see here all of these blue bars, right, which represent our look back periods for each segment. They all just shifted to the right by 1 quarter. So now all of our historical loss experience for our bank is pushed forward to include the more recent 12/31 data point. You'll also notice whenever we make changes to the look back periods for our historical data, the peer data is always in lockstep. It syncs up in real time immediately. So as soon as we change the look back periods to include the 4th quarter for the bank, it also now includes the 4th quarter for every other bank in the peer group. We will talk about peer group, what I mean by when I say peer groups and how do we customize peer groups in a couple minutes. That's the next little topic that we want to cover. Hold on one second. Okay, yeah, I'm also reading questions as they come in here to make sure that there aren't any that I want to tackle at the moment. I think I sort of already answered one of them right just a second ago, and then the other one I think we'll get to in a couple minutes. But now that we've sort of rolled the clock forward for all the historical loss data, we want to go in and make sure our qualitative factor adjustments are still appropriate, right? So we go to the Q factors tab and we say, all right, here are all the qualitative factor adjustments we made a couple months ago. We made a slight adjustment on first liens for the peer experience and for economic adjustments. And then maybe we made some adjustments to non-farm, non-residential, the CRE stuff, because of a slight deterioration in average credit scores. This is just a hypothetical, of course. And we have these adjustments and we've built our narrative, right? We've come in here to the notes section and we've discussed and described why we came up with these adjustments based upon the peer data, based upon economic trends. And now just a couple months later, we're just going to look at these and check them off and kind of work our way down the list and say, do these all still make sense? Are they all still reasonable, or do they need to be modified? And then you modify them as necessary. Next is individual assessments, right? If we had a handful of loans that we needed to cull from the herd and manage on an individual basis because, you know, default is imminent, or we have a very well-defined loss that we might take on the credit, then we come in here and make sure that these calculations or assessments are still accurate. And once we've done that, the last piece of the puzzle is to come right in here and plug in updated balances. So I'll plug in, these are going to be, of course, the last quarter. And so if we want this to be as of January 30th or as of February 15th, whatever is the exact date you want the calculation to be as of, you just override these quarter end balances with your current balances. And this is just an area for you to make note of the date that you're plugging these in so that when you come back to this later, you'll know. It's a reference point for users to know what the date is of these for these balances. And once you've done that, you'll go ahead and you'll want to resave it. You definitely don't want to resave it because then you've lost that old scenario. You've lost the historical integrity of that November scenario, which you always want to have, you know, for historical reference. So you'll always want to save it as a new scenario, give it a new name and a new date. Sample talk with January 2022. Create that. So now we have an additional scenario, and you can toggle between the old scenario and the new scenario at will. So that's a great thing about it. Using our tool, once you update it for the next month, the next quarter, if you want to, you know, what's most important is how is it changed and why is it changed, right? So you can pretty much almost instantaneously toggle between the old and the new scenarios and see exactly how much it moved the needle, where you had increases in reserves in the portfolio, where you might have decreases. You can also export both and then compare them side by side. So if you wanted to take your new run of the tool and export it, let's say into an Excel environment, you can take all the summary data, export it to Excel, and then export the old one, and literally directly in Excel, you can create a differential worksheet if you wanted to, where you can compare and contrast the results between this month and next month, or this quarter and last quarter. So that is, I'm going to head back to the PowerPoint presentation for a second. Hold on with me. I don't know why we. All right. So I think I covered that question. I want to see if there's anything in the Q&A that specifically relates to that. All right, I'm going to just read this question off and then see if we can answer it. Our community bank is running parallel calculations for 2022. Our current ALLL calculation applies the same Q factor percentage across the board using the risk factors, management, economy, past dues. What's the best way to input that in CECL solver, since it breaks down the Q factors by portfolio type? We can input the same total percentage for each segment, but that doesn't show how we come up with the total. Not sure if I understand the question perfectly, but heading back to the tool here and going into the qualitative factors tab. So by default, we have a couple kind of, qualitative factor adjustments kind of hard coded in here. One based upon peer experience and one based upon an economic adjustment if you so desire. When you first create a new scenario, these are all blank and you have these two columns, but all the other qualitative factor adjustments, the internal ones, those things that you've always been doing, right, in your reserve accounting process, whether it's changing in credit scores, risk grade migrations, local economic factors, they're all custom. So what you do is when you want to add additional qualitative factor adjustments, custom ones, you just click on the plus sign and you can type in whatever you want, any custom Q factors, and you can apply those to a single segment or to the whole portfolio. If you wanted to make a 20 basis point adjustment across the board due to general economic weakness on the horizon or something along those lines, you would just create the Q factor and then make your adjustment, let's say 20 basis points across the board for each segment and work your way down. Now, if it,
I think, Steve, I think they asked us later. They were saying they were using the same Q factor for all portfolios. So again, the way they could do, they'd have to do it, per loan category, the same percentage, and just make it identical in each loan category.
Yeah, you just have to type it all the way down.
We don't offer one that just does for the entire loan portfolio one single Q factor. I think that's the question. The other part of the question that's worth answering, though, is I think they also asked, how do you sort of demonstrate how we came up with the Q factor? And I think, I don't know if you've mentioned this, but just show them the memos or the notes that actually also become part of the exported report there.
Yeah, so after we've kind of built up our Q factor adjustments, it calculates the sum automatically right here. And then this is where we leave notes and we build our narrative, whether it's 2 words, whether it's a sentence or a paragraph, about your justification for these particular adjustments you made for this one segment. As soon as you make notes on a segment, those notes get attached to that segment throughout the analysis. Whenever we save a scenario, whenever we export the tool, so that you can come back next quarter, next month and see, what your thoughts were last time. So you can share that with an examiner and keep that organized and efficient. So if you export it as a PDF, then you'll have a whole separate page, which just shows all the notes by segment, organized by segment on your Q factor adjustments. There's also a shortcut. While some people really want to dig in here and do a lot of custom qualitative factor adjustments by segment and kind of build up to a total net Q factor adjustment, if you're running it for the first time and you just kind of want to spitball some quick scenarios and you don't really feel like digging into the details with the Q factors, right here on the summary tab, you'll notice these Q factor, this net adjustment matches the sum of all these that we have here. But you can always just come in here and say, hey, let me see what happens if I put a 1% total Q factor adjustment for my revolving 1 to 4 family. You can plug in a 1% there and not worry about all the components of it, and it'll immediately recalculate the whole tool as a result of that. So it's just kind of a way to do more of a quick and dirty approach, is just to stick a net Q factor adjustment there. And then if and when you feel like it, you can come in here, see that 1% is here. You can come in here and plug in all your detailed components when you see fit. And you'll also notice as I click on the different portfolio segments, I get a bit of a summary, kind of a visual summary of all the most important components of CECL in one chart. We get to see the bank's long-term trend in losses for that segment, the peer group's long-term trend in losses, the gray shaded areas, the look back period that we're using for that segment, and the CECL estimate is the total CECL estimate. The orange line is based upon all the assumptions that we've made to this point. So as soon as you change a Q factor, if I jack up a huge Q factor here, watch what happens to the chart. It just recalculates and kind of rebuilds the chart on the fly. So you get some visual cues there. That answers that question. Let me head back to the presentation now, because I do want to cover, let's talk about peer groups for a minute, if I may. So one thing that you'll find that's pretty ubiquitous throughout the Quick Analytics platform, not just in our CECL tool, but on all the tools that we provide, there's two things that are pretty much everywhere. Peer data, the ability to compare your performance and your experience with your peers, no matter what you're looking at, pretty much. And the second thing is the ability to get your data any way you want to within a single click. So when we're looking at peer data and when we're looking at different outputs for the report, keep in mind that you're always one click away from pulling it into an Excel environment, a PowerPoint environment, from PDFing it or printing it in an attractive sort of readable manner. But when we're talking about building intelligent, appropriate peer groups for CECL, the general criteria you should be using are, is it more important that you get banks that are right in your neck of the woods, right? Do you live in a community or in an area where a statewide average just isn't going to cut it because you have a very specific local economy? Then you might want to focus more specifically on, hey, I only want these two counties, banks in these two counties in my peer group. On the other hand, your state might be a little bit more homogeneous and have less community banks in it. And it's more important for you that you really zoom in on an asset size range that's closer to where you guys are. Less common, but still in certain situations, neither of those might apply if you're a bit more of a specialty business model bank, or maybe you're a newer sort of de novo-ish type bank, and you're looking for banks maybe all around the country that are more what we call like banks, right? They have a similar business plan or model to yours, no matter where they may lie around the country. You think that they're the most appropriate peers to use. Any of those type of criteria, it's very easy to build a custom peer group around, and we'll do that in just a second. But sample size is critical, especially when you're dealing with granular data. So general profitability trends, like looking at ROA, you don't need as big of a sample size to get a good idea of what average ROA is. But when you're looking at net charge-offs on 1 to 4 family, multifamily loans or just credit card loans, you're going to want to have a larger sample size of peers, because we're looking at more granular data. And if you have 7 banks in your peer group and only one of them has credit card loans, guess what the sample size for the entire peer group for credit card losses is going to be? It's going to be from one bank, which is not a very good peer group. So we want to keep in mind, specifically with tools like the CECL tool, where we're looking at long-term loss data at a segment level, that we have a larger than average peer group. Another thing to keep in mind is when I say avoid rose-colored glasses of survivor bias. We're looking at long-term trends here, right? We're looking at asset quality trends, and we're looking at them over not just the last 6 months or year, but over a multi-year cyclical type time period. And if you're just take a snapshot of 7 or 8 banks around you in your neck of the woods that exist today, those are not the same community banks that might have existed a few years ago, especially not during the last credit crisis. And so you want to make sure that if you're considering peer data over a long period of time, that you try to include maybe even institutions that aren't even around today, that were around back then, so you can get an accurate picture of what asset quality really looked like a decade ago. And I'll show you how to do that using our custom peer groups. But I'm going to go ahead and stop telling you what I'm going to do and go ahead and show you how to do that. First, I'm going back to our tool here, to Quick Analytics, and you'll notice right up here on top, I can click on custom peer groups. When I do that, it'll bring me to a home page. As you can see, I spend a lot of time building custom peer groups for Quick Analytics, but you can create as many custom peer groups as you like, and it's very easy to create a new one. There's two basic types of custom peer groups: specific and automatic. We're going to focus on automatic peer groups today, and which is what typically is probably a better approach for CECL. A specific peer group is using the build-up method. That's where you're saying, I want these exact handful of banks that we know that are in our market in the peer group. And while that's fine, you're gonna be picking a lot of individual banks if you want to get a good enough sample size for CECL. The automatic peer groups, on the other hand, offer a little bit more flexibility. And what I mean by that is you define the criteria, we build the peer group, the system maintains it automatically. It's a self-cleaning, self-maintaining peer group. And what I mean by that is, let's say we want community banks in Alabama, and you can further limit it to a handful of counties if you want to get more geographically specific, or MSAs, or you can just stick with the whole state of Alabama. When you say, you know, I want assets between 100 and 500 million, and I only want community banks, and I want to search. So right now there are 60 community banks in Alabama between 100 and 500 million dollars in assets, and that would be a pretty good starting peer group to use for CECL if you were a $250 million community bank in Alabama. Now, the great thing about the automatic peer groups, hence their name, is that what happens if a bank gets too big, if they jump over the $500 million barrier? Or what happens if a bank gets acquired out of existence? The system is constantly looking at using your criteria to keep the peer group consistent. So next quarter, next month, when you rerun something, when you use this peer group, it's going to make the peer group is always going to be accurate to the filters that you created. So it'll automatically remove or add banks as necessary to make sure this is always all the 100 to $500 million banks in Alabama. And secondly, with survivor bias, if you're looking at historical loss data from, say, 2013, and you're using this automatic peer group, it's going to go back in time and look at all the banks that existed in 2013 that met these criteria. And those are the banks that'll be included in a 2013 peer group calculation. So it avoids survivor bias, which is something that's almost impossible to do if you're hand-picking individual banks. You'd have to create a separate peer group literally for every historical period, which is not a good use of anybody's time. So that's how you'd go about. Let's say I wanted to save this. I'm going to go ahead and save the peer group now, give it a name, 100, 500, save it. And you'll see right here on the top of the screen, we now have a new saved peer group, Alabama, 100 to 500 million. If I now head back to our main page and head back to the CECL Solver tool, it's going to right here in this drop-down box for peer groups, I'll be able to choose that custom peer group that I just created. And the second I do that, it'll recalculate Alabama 100 to 500 million. Do that. Should take about 4 or 5 seconds. It is pulling. And in that time, it pulled pretty much every single asset quality data point for every one of those community banks in Alabama going back 15 years. So it literally probably pulled millions of call report data points right there in the at that time. And then you can compare those lifetime loss rates. So that's kind of what I wanted to cover from a peer group best practices sort of standpoint.
Steve, can I interject a couple things?
Please do. Really
mostly answering questions, and it kind of pertinent to what you just talked about. One of the questions was, how do we calculate the historical losses? And I think I'll paraphrase in saying, do you average each annual percentage loss, or do you add up all the losses and divide them by the average balance over that period? It's the latter. In other words, we add up the aggregate losses and then we divide those by the average balance over that period. We think that's a better indicator of, excuse me, of kind of loss of the portfolio as opposed to averaging each individual period's percentage loss that period, if that makes sense. I think that answers that question. The other question is a very good one about securities losses that are supposed to be incorporated into CECL analysis also. It's an unusual concept in some ways, not really, but CECL requires you to also add other losses that might be attributed to securities, life of the loss securities. We do not have a separate section for securities losses, but you can add them to the tool by simply using the plus sign on the bottom of the summary page, which is really designed to allow you to disaggregate the different categories of loans that we permit, and allows you to get more granular on your loans. Yeah, exactly. Steve's showing you there. And you if you did that, if you wanted to break out some other non-farm, non-residential loans, you could do that here, and you'd have to just manually subtract. So if you put 100 million of loans down here, you'd have to manually subtract 100 million of loans above. But you could also use that to just type in held to maturity securities, add your losses, and it would be incorporated into your total CECL losses on the far right. It's a bit of a hack, admittedly, but it does allow you to account for securities losses in this tool. So hopefully that answers that question.
Thank you, Greg. Feel free. I mean, we're kind of, I'm going to roll forward for a second here. Just reminding you to go ahead and click on the Q&A box. Greg's answering some questions here as we go. We do have one other thing I kind of wanted to take a minute to talk about as questions keep coming in, which is great, is just some tips. I know we talk about WARM a lot, because the one piece of the puzzle that we can't get directly from the call report data are those average remaining maturity calculations, right? It's not something that they asked for on the bank, the FDIC call reports. And so it involves you guys gathering and interpreting loan level data, or it's something keep in mind that we can also, for the new people on the call who aren't as familiar with our tool, if you're concerned about calculating your WARMs by call report segment, or it's something you're worried about, or don't really have any readily available manpower or resources for, it's something we can help with. Whether we provide an Excel template, or we can show you exactly what you need to cut and paste in there in order to calculate a WARM by call report segment, or whether we work with you to look at your data and help you calculate it. As much assistance as you need in calculating the WARMs, we can provide. We would love to be able to say, hey, just give your core a call, and they'll send you the WARMs in an output report. But we know that's wishful thinking, and you can get help from your core sometimes, but it's not something that we hold our breath on either. Some tips for calculating the WARMs. We've already talked about how often you need to recalculate it, and it's very much a trial and error situation there. People ask us a lot of questions. How do we handle credit card loans? That's a great question, because they don't have a stated maturity date. So how are we supposed to estimate a maturity on a portfolio of loans that don't have a maturity date? So credit cards are a bit of a different animal from that perspective. And our Excel-based estimator tool kind of shows you how you would do that. But we look at your payment, you look at your payment data as a proxy. So we have to make a global assumption that people won't continue using credit forever. Otherwise, there wouldn't be any maturity. We have to kind of freeze the account and say, today, this is the balance. How long would it take for that balance to get to zero if the person continues to make similar payments as they have in the past, right? If someone has a $2,000 balance and they made a $100 principal payment by month for the last 3 months, we can estimate how many months and how many years it would take for that account to get to zero, given similar payments. So that's our proxy for maturity dates for credit card loans like that. And I know payment data, we see a lot of loan level payment data, and it's not always great in the core systems. Sometimes the last payment made was like a 50-cent fee as opposed to an actual monthly one, or you can't break out the principal from the interest, so you can really get a good estimate of when it would hit zero. In those cases, you just work with the data that you have. You can't get blood from a stone, right? So whatever your data restrictions are, you work within them, or we'll help you work within them. If we have to do an aggregate calculation for your credit card portfolio, where we look at the total payments versus the total balance, and we figure out on average how many months that would take to get to zero. That's a bit simplified, but we work within the constraints that we have to get our best estimate of the WARM calculation. And then I also mentioned, give your results a sanity test, right? After you go through all this loan level data and then calculate a WARM for a segment, take a look at it. Does that intuitively make sense? If your WARM on your construction loans says 12 years, you probably have some bad data in there, right? So, easiest way to do that, once you have that data in an Excel environment, you just, sort all your construction loans by maturity date, and you look for ones that have a maturity date of 50 years from now or something that doesn't make any sense. And you can take those problem loans and just kind of move them out of the bucket, and then it'll recalculate immediately. And you can see, all right, there's just some bad maturity dates on those handful of loans. Now this makes a lot more sense. The other time you might have a WARM which doesn't pass the sniff test is mortgage loans, right? We know mortgage loans have a long stated maturity. We also know prepayments have a huge impact on the mortgage portfolio. The average 30, I think a study was done a couple of years ago, and of course the interest rate environment plays a huge role in this, but that the average 30-year mortgage loan has a 7-year life, 7 to 8 year life, from birth to death as a 7-year, 8-year life. So the ones that you currently have on the books that aren't all new, probably after taking into account significant prepayments, are not going to have a 14 or 15-year WARM on your mortgage loans. So you should probably revisit your prepayment assumptions if you're getting WARMs in the teens, so to speak. Just a bit of a kind of a best practice sanity check for the portfolios. Greg, any other questions coming in that we want to kind of address to the group vocally here? We've got just a minute or two left.
I just answered one about prepay speeds. I mean, Fannie Mae has a bunch of prepay speed information you can go get publicly to help you sort of figure out some of that stuff.
Yes, on the mortgages for sure.
Yeah, sorry, on the mortgages, that's what I meant.
Yeah. So we'll keep an eye on any other questions coming in right now. We've only got a couple more minutes to spend with everybody, but just let everybody know, the next coffee talk we're doing is going to be April 8th at 10 a.m. and you can register for that here as well. For anybody who's new on the call, who is not a current user of the system of the platform and would like just kind of a full-on demo of the interactive tool, looking at your data, and we'll spend some time walking through it with you, and you can see it all with your numbers. Go ahead and you can either schedule a demo with us, but the first step is we do a webinar where we walk through the entire tool interactively, and then after that, if you want to see it with your data, then you can give us a call, and we're happy to do a one-on-one consultation with you from a CECL perspective. We do anticipate having an outside guest next month. Hopefully, someone from the auditing accounting world will be joining us. We will confirm that on a follow-up email that we send. Everyone today will also get a copy, a link with the presentation here and the PowerPoint so that you can refer to the stuff we talked about today. Oh, someone just asked, where did you mention prepayment info is available from? Do you remember the specific site within Fannie?
Well, it's in the I don't have it offhand.
Yeah.
We can provide a link at some point, but
Sure.
Fannie Mae has a lot of public information available on mortgages, particularly on prepay speeds. It's a big issue for mortgage-backed securities, that concept. So there's a ton of data out there. If you just go to the Fannie Mae site and search around, it's pretty easy to find.
And then someone here's got a question about when do we need to manually adjust the loan population balances for things like government guaranteed? Would it be possible to have those fields to allow for the calculation within the input field? So the way we handle that is right in the tool. Actually, I guess I can show you that real quick. Right in the tool here where we're plugging in our current balances. This is where we make any modifications to exclude anything that's outside the scope of CECL, whether it's a guaranteed balance on an SBA portfolio, right? Whether it's any remaining PPP or COVID loans that you have on the books, whether it's any loans you have on the books at fair market value, any loans held for sale, anything that's outside the scope of CECL, or if there were a loss, the loss wouldn't be coming out of your reserve. We don't need to reserve for those small balances. So if we had, let's say we had 10 million in PPP loans still outstanding, I'd come into my C&I balance, I would just net out 10 million, and I'd make a note right here so that everyone knows that we netted out 10 million PPP. And so it's right there, and you can keep track of why your current GL doesn't exactly match the total balance here because of the exclusion for the PPP loans. That's a good question. I think see any others, Greg, that we need to tackle right now, or are we about?
No, I think we tried to answer. I was answering a lot of the questions.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
In writing while you were talking, so people can hopefully refer to those. But I think we answered all of them. I think.
Excellent. Someone was asking about cost for the tool. That's something that's asset based, and discounts for ICBA members and other types of depending on the relationship that you have with QwickRate and Quick Analytics and the size of your institution. So feel free to just give us a buzz anytime, and we're happy to share, give you a pricing quote as soon as you need it. But thanks everybody. I really appreciate you taking the time to join us this morning, and we'll be back at it again next month. Well, hopefully with some other outside viewpoints. And join us next week for a webinar where we just kind of go into depth on how to use the interactive tool. Thanks, everyone.